sat at the edge of the bed, rubbing his hands together as he stared at the floor. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. He heard the soft rhythm of Linda's breathing beside him. She was still asleep, curled up under the blankets, like she had been doing for years. He turned toward the mirror on the dresser. The face looking back at him wasn't the one he remembered. He had always been a strong, confident man, someone who carried himself with purpose. But now, his hair was thinning, and the gray had completely overtaken the brown. The lines on his face, once faint, were now deep, like carved reminders of the years that had passed. A strange feeling crept over him. It wasn't sadness exactly, but something close, a quiet sort of loss. He didn't feel like himself anymore. Mark reached for his watch on the nightstand, fastening it with slightly trembling fingers. He wasn't as strong as he used to be. His shoulders ached after a long day. His knees protested every time he stood up too fast. He glanced back at Linda. Even in sleep, she looked peaceful, her silver hair fanned across the pillow. He knew she had changed too, but somehow she carried it differently. She had found new things to love: painting, yoga, book clubs. Meanwhile, he felt like he was just drifting. And it wasn't just his body that had changed. His marriage had too. Linda stirred as the smell of coffee filled the kitchen. She poured herself a cup, watching Mark as he sat at the table, scrolling through his phone. She missed the days when they used to sit together and talk in the mornings. Lately, it felt like they were just two people sharing a house rather than a married couple. They still did things together, grocery shopping, watching TV after dinner. But there was a quiet distance between them, one that had grown without either of them realizing it. Linda was still an affectionate woman. She reached for his hand often. She leaned into his touch. But lately, he didn't respond the way he used to. It wasn't that he pulled away. No, it was something more subtle, like he wasn't fully present. She had asked herself many times what had changed. Had she done something wrong? Was he losing interest? Or was it simply the years taking their toll? Mark took a sip of his coffee and looked up, catching her gaze. "What's wrong?" he asked. Linda hesitated, then shook her head. "Nothing," she said, forcing a smile. But deep down, she knew nothing was exactly the problem. That evening, after dinner, Linda sat on the couch beside Mark, close enough that their shoulders touched. She had been thinking about this moment all day. "Mark," she said softly. He didn't look up from the news on TV. "Do you still find me attractive?" That got his attention. He turned to her, brow furrowed. "What?" She gave a small, uneasy laugh. "I don't know. I just feel like things have changed between us." Mark frowned. "Of course, I still love you. That's not what I asked." Silence settled between them. Finally, Mark sighed, setting the remote down. "Linda, it's not about you." "Then what is it?" He hesitated, rubbing his hands together, searching for the right words. I don't feel like myself anymore. I don't feel like the man I used to be." Linda's expression softened. "Mark," he shook his head. "I used to be strong, confident. I knew who I was. But now I see a man with gray hair and tired eyes, and I don't know if that's the same man you married." Linda reached for his hand. "We've both changed. That's what happens. But just because we're not the same people doesn't mean we've lost each other." Mark looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in a long while. And in that moment, something shifted. Over the next few weeks, things began to change. Not all at once, but slowly, like the first signs of spring after a long winter. Mark started opening up. He told Linda about his insecurities, about how aging had made him feel invisible, about how he feared he was becoming less of the man she once fell in love with. And in return, Linda shared her own fears. She told him how she sometimes felt like she was disappearing in a different way. How women, especially as they got older, often felt unseen. How she worried that one day he'd look at her and see nothing more than a familiar presence, instead of a woman he desired. The conversations weren't always easy, but they were honest. They started making more of an effort, going on walks together, having real conversations over coffee instead of just sitting in silence. One night, Mark surprised Linda with a weekend getaway, just a small cabin by the lake, like the ones they used to visit when they were younger. They danced in the living room to their favorite songs. They laughed. They sat outside under the stars, holding hands like they hadn't in years. That night, as Mark held Linda close, he realized something important. Confidence wasn't about youth. It wasn't about looks. It was about connection. A few weeks later, Mark stood in front of the mirror again. The gray hair was still there. The wrinkles hadn't gone anywhere. But the man looking back at him, he recognized him again. Not because he had changed back into who he used to be, but because he had learned to embrace who he was now. When Linda walked into the room, he turned to her with a smile. "You look beautiful," he said. She blinked in surprise. "Thank you." Then he took her hand and spun her around. She laughed, caught off guard. "What are you doing?" "Dancing with my wife." She shook her head but let him pull her close. As they swayed, Mark realized something else. Aging hadn't taken anything away from them. It had given them something new, a deeper love, a quieter confidence, and the understanding that no matter how much time passed, they would always find their way back to each other. And that was the most beautiful thing of all.